So I'm going to kick this off by going ahead and just logging into my 8base account. So 8base is a backend as a service, right? So when you think of application development, most people, when they have an idea for an app, they think of, I want to see an interface that looks like this and has some data in it that I care about. However, for anyone in software knows, there's a ton of things that go behind the scenes to enable that to happen. And part of that equation or part of that puzzle is the backend, right? And sometimes you can have a microservice architecture, sometimes you have monolithic apps. However, really what we're looking at is database, API, roles and security, and then server-side logic, right? How do you do server-side server-side code? And so when it comes to 8base, what we offer is essentially very analogous to what Firebase would be from Google, right? However, we offer it, we offer a backend as a service built on AWS with a more modernized tech stack. So we're using AWS Lambda for serverless. That gives us a highly scalable infrastructure. We use GraphQL as the API specification, and we dynamically generate that based on the data model. So it's a really great developer productivity tool. We give you the tools to design your own data model using a graphical user interface. However, that's all migrated against an automatic way from the software, an Aurora MySQL database. So you're built on top of a MySQL relational database hosted on AWS. And then there's a lot of peripheral services that come into there. And the way you can think of that is every time you create a new workspace on 8base, right? Create workspace, select your region, select the plan that you're going to use. It goes off and spins up a unique instance of all those resources for you. So every project you have has dedicated infrastructure. And it's a fully managed service, so you don't have to worry about any of that. So I'm going to go ahead and say that we're going to say this is the webinar workspace 1. And I'm lucky that I have an 8base email, so I get my free plan. I'm going to go ahead and create that. And like I said, this is going in the background. We're using services like Terraform, CloudFormation to go ahead and just create all that for you so that your project is up and ready to go. And so webinar workspace, whoop. All right, page reloads. Cool. And now I'm going to jump into my webinar workspace 1. So that little place where we were called Developer Home, that was an overview of all my workspaces, kind of a top level account view. Whereas now I'm dropping into an actual workspace, right? And so whether this was for a specific project or whether this was I'm storing data that multiple different front ends talk to, this is my interface to configure my backend, and it has an API endpoint that I could use already, right? The endpoint is live. That I can start querying data and writing data from. Now, this is just a simple dashboard. And while there are 101 ways that we see people using 8base workspaces, we tend to think of the core of a workspace really being the data model. So if I go over here to the data tab, this is where I have the ability of creating my data model, right? So let's think of a system to where I'm building an invoicing system, right? I'm going to add a table called invoices to my database, invoices. By default, 8base is managing the ID field, the created at timestamp, the updated at timestamp, and a relationship to the users table, which is called created by. So any record created via the API by an authenticated user, it will establish a relationship between those records. However, for my invoices table, I'm going to say that, okay, every invoice has an invoice number. I'm going to say this is a number field and it's no duplicate numbers, all right, and it's mandatory. I'm going to set some validations. We're never going to have more than a million. I think that's a million invoices in my system. I create that field. Cool, that's on my table. I'm also going to do another one called, let's just call it receipt. Wow, can I do this? I think that's wrong too. Yeah, it is. There we go. Okay, cool. So receipt, a file, and this is going to be a file field. I create that. Now what's important to know here is just by adding this field type file, my API is already ready to have file uploads, file downloads, view links. It's all pre-configured and all stored in S3 with cryptographically signed links. So really secure solution to handling file uploads and storage, and then having that tied into your data model. Now, I'm sure that you kind of can project from here to where if we wanted to keep building out our invoices table, we keep adding field types. And we have every field type that you would expect or need to use, right? So text, which would be strings, numbers, dates, switches, which are either Boolean values or enumerated fields, right? So let's say that you wanted something to be a true or false field, it's a Boolean field. Or let's say that you had on this invoice, draft, pending, and paid, right? You could use a switch field to define those. File, which we did, table, which are relationships, and we'll look at that in a minute. Smart fields, which are essentially JSON objects with validation. JSON, if you just want to store arbitrary JSON in your database, as well as geo fields, which are really cool. If you're building any type of application that uses geo coordinates, right? So whether that's plotting locations across the map or anything else that could be, by storing GeoJSON data in a geo field, lat long coordinates, let's say, the API will let you already or immediately start doing location-based filtering. So you could say, well, show me all the restaurants that were created within this vicinity, within a 25-mile radius, or do plots. Really sophisticated feature. Cool. So now with that invoices table, we think of this in the terms of this is a relational database, right? So I'd want to establish a relationship between these tables. 8base by default is giving you a users table that you can use. So I'm just going to drag and drop this over here. And here's where I would be able to say, oh, what's the relationship between these two tables, right? So let's say that the invoice has a recipient, right? And the recipient has many invoices, right? Because they have multiple invoices sent to them. And so this relationship models that correctly, allow multiple invoices per user. However, if we wanted it to be a many-to-many relationship, a one-to-many in either direction, a one-to-one, or even a belongs to if there's a validation on one of those directions, we could accomplish all that, all right? So here we're going to say that you allow many invoices per user and the recipient field is mandatory. And I go ahead and create that field, right? Now, just one thing that's important to mention here is we have examples of users with hundreds of tables in their database solving really complex business use cases. And then, of course, we have examples of people with 1 or 2 tables in their database. This is really as flexible as you want to make it and as performant as you need it for your use case. So simple interface, powerful solution. And we go a little bit deeper with if you want to go to this level to where, hey, if I wanted to add custom indices to improve query performance on my tables, I could accomplish that. If I wanted to write SQL views that aggregate data into a read-only table from multiple tables, I can accomplish that. And these are essentially all ways that I can make my tables more performant if I need to. Now, one other thing that's really cool here is that you can, right now we have one integration with Salesforce. We're actually deep in creating the specification that will be an open specification so people can create essentially any native integration on 8base, even though we have a way, which I will get into later, which you can connect to any data source. However, with this Salesforce integration, what that looks like is if I wanted to connect to an external data source, I can say I'm going to connect Salesforce. Now I'm going to go in here and create this integration. And I always forget my Salesforce password, so I'm going to warn you ahead of time. I'm going to go in and you can connect to either a sandbox account or just a normal Salesforce account. In my case, it doesn't matter. Cool. And let's see, hopefully this was the right password. Oop, it wasn't. Here, let's see something. And my dash lane is killing me here. There we go. So I think, did I get it? Good thing I have my phone. 1 second. 88183. Cool. All right. Got it. So essentially what's happening here is 8base is reading my Salesforce schema. It's not importing my Salesforce data. The data will always remain in Salesforce. However, it's essentially building the API or a GraphQL API that models my Salesforce schema so I can very conveniently use the Salesforce API. So it says it was successful and now we can add some tables. So now if I go back to Data Builder, you can see that we have this new Salesforce section here. And by default, it just brought in my account table, my contact table, my lead, and my opportunity table, right? Now, if I wanted to bring in any other table from Salesforce, I could. There's like 400 of them. It's wild. All I'd have to do is click on any of these and it would pull it right in. Now we can see that, for example, on the account table, it brought in all those fields. And if I want to, I can actually cross-connect data between these two databases. So for example, let's say that we go back to our invoices table and that we're not really using 8base to manage users, right? Invoices are actually belonging to accounts. And while we're storing invoice data in 8base, we're storing account data in Salesforce. So I'm just gonna delete this relationship to the invoices table. And instead, I'm gonna add a new relationship between our accounts in Salesforce and our invoices. And once again, we're gonna allow multiple invoices per account. Now I create that field, and let's go ahead and add a little data in our database. So here, what we're gonna do is we're gonna create the first invoice, which is gonna be 1, and I think it's a number field. So let's just say it's invoice 1. And I'm just gonna find some random invoice on the web. Cool, I'll bring this one right up, right from Google. And I'm gonna say that this invoice belongs to one of these accounts, which are all coming from my Salesforce account. I'm just gonna say Edge Communication. All right, so we have our first invoice in the database. Now, this is really cool, right? In this short demo, we were able to essentially set up this entire infrastructure on AWS, configure a simple data model, and we already have data in our database, which includes relational data as well as objects like PDFs or images or videos, whatever it might be. However, what the tremendous productivity tool of 8base is that while we are making these changes, it is auto-generating the 8base GraphQL API for us. What does that mean? That means that I'm just gonna take this invoice ID here. I'm gonna go to this thing called the API Explorer. Now, this is a GraphQL Explorer, right? So the query I'm about to write here is the exact same query that I'd write in my client-side application. So if I was a React developer, a Vue.js developer, a vanilla JavaScript developer, or iOS, Android apps, doesn't matter, I'd be able to write a GraphQL query in my front end, send that query to my backend API, which was the API endpoint we looked at earlier, and then expect the exact same data response I'm about to see here. So let's go ahead and say we're gonna write a query, and we're gonna look for our invoice. We wanna look at the invoice that has an ID, which is, I'm just gonna throw that in there. Cool. Now, what do I want in response from that? I want the ID of the invoice. I want to know when it was created at. I want to know when it was updated at. I want to know the number, and I want to know the invoice number. Cool. So I run that query, and that's the data I get back from my API, right? In the exact same format. Now, all queries in 8base are relational, whether they're done through lists or looking up single records. So if I wanted to also know, hey, what account does it belong to? I want the ID of that account. I want the name on that account, and I want the phone number of that account. And then also, let's say I wanted the actual invoice or the receipt itself. I could say, okay, well, I want the ID and I want the download URL of that receipt. I can all specify that. And since it's a graph, it's pulling in all that information through those relationships and giving me a single really clean response. And let's also remember too, that it was able to pull this data from Salesforce, merge it into the response, and just give me one request response back. Super powerful. right? Because you're essentially not having to worry about all the stitching yourself, as well as you're not having to share or make multiple API calls to get all the information that you need for developing some type of view, screen, or list, or whatever you might be trying to accomplish. Now, this was for querying a single record, right? For example, I'm just going to edit this a little bit to where say, hey, we actually wanted a list of invoices, right? And I'm just going to retrofit this to say for every item in that list, we want the same information. Let me just fix that there. Cool. And so now if I ran this, it would be giving me back an array, right? And if I had multiple invoices, they'd all come back. But the reason I show you this is because already into this API, have we built in all the advanced functionality that you would need, right? So for example, pagination, sorting, search, filtering, grouping, aggregation, it's all there ready for you to use. So for example, and these things all work again relationally. So for example, if I wanted to look for a list of invoices that were created by a user whose email address contains the string 8-base, right? I can run that query. I'm going to get back the list because I created it. I'm Sebastian Scholl at 8base.com. However, I definitely don't have 7-base in my email address, and so I get back my empty list, right? And these filters all work as compounds, so I can do and or, I can do them at different levels of nesting. It goes really deep, and it's really useful. Now, for querying, right, that's reading data from the API. We give you, for every table, that list query and that individual record finder, right? So the find by ID, essentially, or any unique and mandatory field. However, if we look at mutations, which are write operations, let's see what it generated for us from the invoice table. So we can already create invoices, create many at one time, delete or destroy them. That's a soft delete versus a hard delete. Delete or destroy by filter, running a delete or destroy operation on many records at one time based on a filter predicate. We can restore them. And so a soft deleted record can be restored back to the database. Or we can update records or update by filter. And update by filter is actually a really cool one because it allows you, based on the data type to, or the field type, to use subatomic operations. So for example, let's say we had 1,000 invoices in our database and they all have a different invoice number, right? However, we wanted to increment all numbers by 2 for whatever reason. Instead of having to make 1,000 calls to each record, update each one, the update by filter would allow us to say, hey, on the invoice number, let's add 2 to every individual record, and that's one request. And so, and that goes for the appropriate predicates for dates, strings, geofields, all that type of stuff. So super powerful feature of the API. And now finally, after we go through mutations, we lastly generate subscriptions for you, which are essentially WebSocket connections over AWS Lambda. So if you have any type of real-time data requirement in your application, that could be for real-time notification feeds, messaging applications, any type of real-time update. You know, for example, we're going to text you a code, and we're going to email you a button. Once you click the button, the browser will automatically get an update that you've consented. You can build all that into your applications, and it's based on events, database events like create, update, or delete on any table in your database, and even on a filtered record set. So really what's important to know is that when it comes to any create, read, update, or delete operation within different flavors, as well as the subscription thing that we just discussed, this API already has us handled. Our front-end developers could just start building the client-side application and have this really robust, rich backend to connect to. Now, what's important to know is, like we said, we set up that database and that data model, right? Simple, but you get where we could go with it. We already have this super awesome API that we can use. However, for getting information in and out of the system. However, what it immediately begs you to ask is, okay, well, how do I make sure that only the right people, right, are being able to read records they're supposed to read, update records they're supposed to update, not see certain resources that they're not supposed to? How do I introduce the concept of roles and permissions into my application, and without having to make it a front-end concern, which is never appropriate? So essentially what we did to accommodate that is introduced roles and permissions as a native feature into 8base. Now, what's important to know about 8base is, so for example, if I go to my query, I can see that I have a users table, right, in my database, and then I also have a table called roles. And there's a many-to-many connection between the two, right? So a user can have many roles, and a role can belong to many users. That's the start. Now, if I go to app services here, I can manage my roles. So here, by default, you have an administrator role, which essentially is always a role that has all permissions enabled, right? So we actually don't allow you to edit the permissions of your administrator role because it's supposed to just be for very select few people, right? And on the contrast to that, we have the guest role, which you can configure, right? However, the guest role is defining if someone hits your API without authentication, what can they still see? So maybe, probably in our invoices system, this wouldn't work, but let's say we had some type of simple CMS backend where certain products, are publicly readable. You'd be able to find the permissions for unauthenticated users access that table via the guest role. However, I'm just going to go ahead here and say that the user of our invoice app is actually the salesperson generating the invoice, right? And so I'm going to say salesperson is the role that we create, and just give it a simple description: a salesperson sending invoices. Cool. Add the role. Excellent. And so now that that role is created, I'm going to go in and edit it. Now, what's cool about this is now in the permissions section of this new salesperson's role that we just created, I can define at the data level what any user that has this role can do, right? So if a user has no roles, the only things they can do via the API are what are specified for them to be allowed to do via the guest role, right? However, then once I give them a role, that is granting them more permissions that now will be enabled when they query the API. And it does not matter what query gets sent. So a developer could accidentally write a query that says delete all invoices, right? But unless the authenticated user has a permission that says you can delete invoices, and not only delete them, but delete all of them, that will be rejected by the API and an error message returned to the client app that says you don't have permission to do that, right? So it's very secure in that way. Now here, I'm going to ignore a lot of the permissions. I'm just going to go down to my invoices table and kind of configure it for the sake of the salesperson. So we absolutely want a salesperson to be able to create invoices. That's the whole reason they're using the app. So I'm going to leave that box checked. Now, when it comes to reading invoices, we don't want users, we don't want salespeople reading other salespeople's invoices. We only want them to read their own. So we're going to say that they can only read their own. And let's say that for whatever reason, we didn't want them to be able to update invoices. It's you create an invoice, and instead of editing it, you just have to send it. And if you want to edit it, you create a new one. So here we're just going to say that they can't update any and they can't delete any. And if we wanted to, we could even go into field level access, right? To where even if someone has the ability to, let's say, read a record, right? Let's say that we don't want them to update an invoice number. We already said that they can't update the record, so that would be nullified. However, if they could update the record for whatever reason, we could also say that, well, they can update the record, but not the invoice number. And they can't update the update at timestamp. They can't update at the create at timestamp per se. So save that, right? And very quickly was I able to now for this role configure how I want that role to be able to essentially interact via the API with this invoices table, right? And this was just done using the simple selectors of users records, no records, and then some of the custom access stuff. However, what is cool is this can go a lot deeper. This is actually the reason why 8base is able to build fully multi-tenant SaaS solutions for our customers because of our roles and permissions engine. Now, how that works is the use of these things called custom filters. So for example, let's say in my data model, invoices, well, right now invoices belong to customers, but let's say that this was a SaaS solution to where companies could sign up, right? And those different companies all had different salespeople under their company, and they could all send different invoices on behalf of their company, right? So now I have this concern where I don't want people belonging to different companies to see each other's data, right? Well, essentially what I'd be able to do is write a custom filter that says, well, an invoice belongs to we're gonna get errors because the data model is not set up, but we'll just kind of work through it, where the invoice belongs to a company, and a company has users, right? Or let's just say that the relationship with salespeople. And of those salespeople, it would be some, so one or more of them is self, is the alias we use. So equals true. Cool. So essentially what this filter is saying that, hey, if the invoice belongs to a company where that company has salespeople and one of the salespeople is this authenticated user, then they can update the record, right? And once again, just like the filters in the API, this can support and/or predicates, all different levels of nesting. You can get really complex with these things, you can handle very complex use cases with these things, and have really accurate and fine-grained permissioning for the API. So pretty cool feature. Now, roles can be assigned in multiple ways. The first way is that 8base will help you with authentication for your application. Now, we are not an auth provider. We are never storing usernames and passwords. We encourage you always to work with an auth provider like Okta, Auth0, Cognito. There's 100 of them out there, and they're all do a great job. All we ask is when you create one, you let us know the OpenID provider URL, or you, for example, for like Auth0, we have it as first class, and that you can define some of the credentials that are important for us to validate the incoming ID token. But essentially, the ID token that's issued from your auth provider gets included as a header on your API request, and then we're able to validate it. Within the payload of that ID token, the user identifying credential is in there. So let's say that that's the email address, right? Using that email address on a valid token, we're able to map it to the correct user role, or the correct user in the 8base database, and then see their roles. And that's how that whole system links up. So for example, if I were to say, I'm going to create, I'm just going to use this thing called 8base Authentication, which might sound very contradictory to what I just said, but it's essentially AWS Cognito in the background, and it's mainly used for development purposes, just an easy way to help you get started when you're in development. So for this one, I'm going to say is this is my default auth profile, 8base Authentication, open to all. That means anyone can sign up for my app. If I wanted to, I could white label it to certain domains. Maybe that's for only a certain company, whatever you'd want to do. Open to all. And then I could say, okay, by default, anyone that signs up is a salesperson. I add that profile, and now that's set up and it's giving me the information I need to initialize the authentication module or an authentication client in my client application. Now, there are many use cases where you'd want to do role assignment, not only at sign up. Like someone signs up for your app, they use it for a few days, and then they upgrade to a subscription tier, and now they get new roles, right? What's important to note about 8base, and this is really just a testament to the flexibility of the system, is that everything that we are doing here in the console can be done via the API. This console that we're looking at here is only our user interface for a larger API, which is the 8base backend. So for example, if I wanted to, let me do a mutation here. If I wanted to create new roles, add permissions to them, assign them to users, I can do that all via the API. I can even go as far as if I wanted to go into my system, I could programmatically, let's see, I could programmatically create update tables, do all this type of stuff, right? So really, you're not limited to using the console. And when it comes to creating resources for your project, that can even be something that's done in an automated way in your application. So super flexible, and this accommodates a really wide number of use cases. Now, if I go to this area called settings here, some last minute things. First off is that we have the ability to do API tokens. So the whole idea of authentication that we just talked about is using an auth provider to authenticate a user and get a expiring token that has the user credential, the user payload in it, right? If you just need a static token, you can create those. So for example, I could say that, my admin token and administrator, and I create that. And now this token is essentially keys to the kingdom, right? So anyone that has this, and I'm going to delete this workspace after we're done, could do anything they want to this workspace, and this token never expires, and it doesn't matter how many people are using it, right? Now, that can be a really quick way to do some development, right? I wouldn't recommend using it that way. Mainly why we have these is, for example, let's say that you wanted to write functions that deploy to GitHub, and then after some static syntax checks or something like that, deploy those functions to 8base. This token could be used as the token that authenticates the CI/CD script, right? So that's one use case. Another use case for API tokens, which is really cool, is API tokens, just like everything else, is stored in a table, which you have access to via your API or your data model. So let's say that you wanted to authenticate IoT devices, right? You could have a table called devices, which stores all these different records for different devices in your network. And each of those devices could have a one-to-one relationship with an API token, which is programmatically generated. And so then you create some type of onboarding flow to where the token gets created, issued, stored on the device locally. And then whenever that device is talking to the network, it's using its API token, and that's its authentication credential. So there's a lot of really clever, cool ways to support a wide number of use cases that you can use the API tokens. Everything else here, really, at the end of the day, is normal platform stuff, right? We don't need to go over how the billing stuff or the team stuff. It's all pretty simple. However, what's important to note at this point is that this is the 90% or 80%, let's say, right? Meaning that working on a project that has a backend requirement, 8base at this point is probably knocking out 80% of that requirement of what you need to get that project up, running in production and stable. However, that 20% that's left is what's unique to the idea, right? So it's, if you are building some social network, some marketplace, some whatever it might be, everything that you have here at this point, besides the data model and some roles, is generic, right? And that's the value we're bringing, but you need a way to be able to build that custom piece of it. And so we thought of a lot of different ways of approaching this problem. We thought of doing a DSL, we thought of doing kind of a drag and drop type coding interface. But what we really felt at the end of the day was the power we should give people is the power of JavaScript, right? The power of dropping into code and really building things as customized as they want to. So that's what we did. What I'm going to do really quickly is switch my screen over to my code editor. Cool. And I'm going to drop into 8base here and demos. And I'm going to create what is a new 8base server-side project, right? So essentially, I'm going to say we have an 8base command line tool. You install it via npm or yarn. Super easy to do that. And then I would be able to run 8base init, let's say webinar 1 functions. And I'm just going to say that with syntax we're using is JavaScript. We support JavaScript or TypeScript. Either one that you want to write in, we compile it and handle the deployment. So when I run that, it's now going to ask me, hey, what workspace do you actually want to connect to or deploy these functions to? I'm going to say the webinar workspace 1. And now here it's essentially created this demo project for me, which I'm going to open up here in VS Code. So code, 8-base demos, webinar 1 functions. Cool. Excellent. So I have those right here. Now what I'm about to show you, if you're familiar with serverless framework, it's very familiar to serverless framework, or looks very similar. However, we did not use serverless framework. We just adopted some patterns from it because we thought it was a really great, really great way of approaching this. So essentially here at the base of our project, we have this 8base.yaml function or 8base.yaml file in which we have all these functions declared. And these functions are just demo functions so that when you create your project, you have some examples of what you can do. We offer 4 function types, and those are resolvers is number 1. So essentially when you have on your GraphQL API, all those operations we looked at, the invoice create, invoice update, so on and so forth, those are resolver functions that we manage for you. But you can add custom ones with any name, expecting any inputs and giving any response, right? And so this declaration is for resolvers. The next one are tasks. Essentially, if you have a function that if you have code that you would like to encapsulate and more easily use across other functions, you can write a task for that. A good example would be, let's say that you had a generic script for sending emails. And in many different places in your server-side code, you wanted to send emails. Send email would be a good task that you pass it some data to that customizes the email. But that single task is the point in your code that concern is handled. Tasks can also be run on schedules. That's important to note. So for example, if I say I have a schedule at a rate of every 5 days, this task would invoke once every 5 days. This also supports cron syntax as well. So you can do any time interval you want, and that's the cadence at which the function will invoke. We also have webhooks. So if you want to stand up a webhook for a third-party system to talk back to 8base, you can do that really easily. All you need to do is give it a path, and this path will be actually appended to the end of your workspace URL. So you can give it a unique kind of web path. And then the HTTP verb at which that endpoint will invoke. So any get, post, put, patch, delete, request, you can set any of those up. This is really valuable, for example, when you want to support callbacks. Let's say that you're using Stripe as your merchant gateway or your payment solution, and you want Stripe to send some type of data back to 8base every time a transaction happens. You could just say, hey, send it to Stripe webhook, make a post request to Stripe webhook at 8base, and that's what will be received here, including the payload that it sends over. And then finally, triggers, which are hugely important. Triggers are your ability to essentially define functions that run either before a create, read, or a create, update, or delete event happens on a specified table, or after the create, update, or delete operation happens on the specified table. So for example, by default, this trigger is saying this runs before any user is created in the database. And if I go ahead and look at the code, which is stored in this directory, triggers handler, cool. I can see that this is a generic JavaScript function, right? Inside of which I get the event, which is where I can get the data for this function. So for example, on a user create event, I would be able to say, what's the user's first name? Let's set it as a variable. So my variable user first name is event.data, and then it would be first name on the user object right there, right? Now, what's important here is I can reject the update, right? So if I wanted to perform some type of unique validation, I could do that and then reject the user for whatever reason or any other record. I could change data and manipulate it before it's being saved. And what's important is that this is just a Node.js runtime, right? And we have JavaScript. Any part of the NPM ecosystem that I want to use in this function, I can. So for example, if I wanted to import the Twilio SDK from Twilio, and in here, await for Twilio to send an SMS to some phone number. There we go. I have that GitHub Copilot thing running right now, so that's why it's like writing code for me. It's pretty cool. However, if I wanted to send an SMS via Twilio in this function before the user record's created, do anything that I want to do, I can accomplish it in here. So highly flexible in that way. And what's also important too is that, let's say I wanted to test this function. This will not work because I don't have Twilio installed. However, I could run this function locally to test it by running 8-base invoke local trigger and then naming a mock file, which is giving me essentially a stub object that I have power over. I can control this object to test out different inputs, and I would get the response in my console. Now, let's just imagine that we wrote, let me delete that. Let's imagine that we wrote a ton of extremely useful and helpful code here, doing exactly what we wanted to do. Deployment is pretty simple. I'm going to run 8-base deploy, and I have to move into the directory, excuse me, webinar functions. I run 8-base deploy, and now this is handling the packaging and deployment of my functions. They're going to be live in about a minute or two on my project. Now, it really is that simple. But that also opens up a vulnerability that a lot of people recognize, where it's, well, hey, if I'm deploying bad code immediately to production, that's a big concern. 8-base does offer native CI/CD capabilities. So for example, in my workspace, I could enable CI/CD, which then would allow me to create master, staging, development, as many different branches as I want. That is all an intrinsic CI/CD pipeline. So if I go from master to staging to development, I always then can only push my changes to my development workspace or my development environment, and then 8-base will help me migrate those changes through all the way to production. Each of those environments are all completely siloed, so they have their own API endpoint, they have their own database, they have their own, like everything there is completely isolated. So you can safely test or hook them up to testing servers or whatever you want to do without worrying about corrupting your production environment. So we can see that it deployed successfully. Great. If I wanted to look at those environments, 8-base environment list, I believe that in this case, I just have a master environment set up because we just created this workspace and didn't configure it. However, it's in there. So I've done a lot of talking at this point. Love any questions or any clarifications that you guys would like to jump into.